Madam President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I rise today to let the American people know that there are some of us left in Washington, some of your representatives, who actually do care about the mounting debt. We now have over $22 trillion worth of debt. And you ask yourself, whose fault is this? How did it get so out of control? How do we accumulate so much debt that we're accumulating debt at $1.5 million every minute? Under the first George W. Bush, the debt went from about $5 trillion to $10 trillion. Under President Obama, it went from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. Under President Trump, it'll go from 20 to about 30 trillion. So the debt is out of control, and you ask yourself, why is no one doing anything about it? Whose fault is it? Well, really, I think you can see that it's a bipartisan problem. Both parties are at fault. So we have a debt now that exceeds $22 trillion. If you've ever seen the debtclock.org, you can see just the numbers spinning out of control. Now, how would that apply to an individual? Each individual American in the country owes about $70,000 of that debt. And some people say, well, it's so enormous, do deficits really matter? In fact, I think it was one of the Cheneys, one of the big government Republicans way back when, said deficits don't matter. Well, it actually does matter. It matters to your budget each year, because what happens is as interest grows, it crowds out everything else. In fact, interest right now is the fourth leading item in the budget, only behind Medicare and Social Security and defense. But if you look at interest on the debt, what's going to happen over the next decade or so, interest is in the red, and you can say interest is climbing and will exceed over time both defense and also Social Security. So it is a real problem. As interest on the debt rises, it sort of crowds out all other spending. So what are people doing about it? What are your senators doing about it? And what are your congressmen doing about it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The Democrats control the House. Will they have a budget this year? So far, goose egg, no budget. How about the Republicans in the Senate? Do they have a budget? Well, they did pass one out, but there's no plans of ever voting on it on the floor. So what we will get to vote on today is my budget. My budget is called the penny plan budget. What my budget does is it cuts 1 penny out of every dollar. And it's interesting because as I see people come to Washington, and almost everybody that comes to Washington wants money, and I tell them, well, first of all, I have to tell you we have no money. We're $1 trillion short this year. But people have such good causes, and they say, we want money for this disease and that disease. And I say, well, wait a minute. What if we said that we'll give you 99% of what you had last year? We'll give you 1 penny less. So if your charity or your disease or the thing that you're concerned about got $100 million, next year you get $99 million. And here's the interesting thing. Most of these people are advocates for federal money. They even often work for the state government up here looking for more federal money. And I've yet to meet a person, liberal, conservative, or independent, doesn't say, I'd get 99% of what I got last year and everybody would get the same. We'd spend 99% of what we spent last year, and it'd be spread across every sector that the right wants, that the left wants. And I'd say, yeah, we spend 99%, and if you do it, guess what? The budget balances in 5 years, or at least it did until recently. I've been producing the penny plan budget for the last 6 or 7 years, and every year until now, it actually balanced in 5 years if you cut 1 penny out of every dollar. But guess what? The longer you wait, the more interest there is, the more of a burden of debt there is, the harder it is to actually fix the problem. So this year, for the first time, we're having to call it the 2 penny plan. Still balances in 5 years, but we have to spend only 98% of what we spent the previous year. What would happen? You'd still have 98% of your government. Is there anybody in America who believes there's not 2% waste? I think if you did a survey of the American people, they'd be more accurate than the people up here. There's got to be 10% waste in these programs. I mean, we find it all the time. I'll give you 2 quick examples. We're spending $50 billion a year in Afghanistan. And even for those who advocate staying in Afghanistan another decade or more, which I don't, we're spending the money on wasteful things. We spent $90 million on a luxury hotel across from our embassy. It was never completed. It's a shell of a building, and the Taliban can crawl up in this building and shoot down at our embassy. Now our soldiers have to risk life and limb to patrol an empty hotel that somebody ripped us off on for $90 million and fled the country. We built a $45 million gas station in Afghanistan. It's supposed to cost $500,000. 83 cost overruns later, it cost $45 million. And guess what kind of gas they have at the pump at this gas station? If you could ever get there to see if it exists. Natural gas. Because somebody decided that the defense industry should be reducing the carbon footprint of the world, and we weren't supposed to be killing our enemies so much as reducing the carbon footprint of the world. So we built a natural gas station in Afghanistan. Problem? They don't have any cars. The average income in Afghanistan is about $800 a year, and there are very few people with cars. The ones who do have cars, none of them run on natural gas. The examples go on and on and on. We spent $2 million studying whether or not when someone sneezes on the food in front of you at the cafeteria, whether you are more or less likely to eat the food. Took them $2 million to figure that one out. This is throughout government. There is at least 1 or 2% waste. There's probably 10% waste and 10% money that just is throwing the money. It would be almost better just to burn the money. So what do? Who's up here saying anything about it? The media says no one is. And this is fake news because it's a lie, because when the tax cut came around, I insisted that the tax cut be paid for. How many people voted with me? Eight senators, all Republicans, not one Democrat. So you ask yourself, what do the Democrats think of this? Are the Democrats for balancing the budget? No, they don't care at all about the deficit. Do Republicans care? Some do, most don't. So we're going to have a vote on my budget, which cuts 2 pennies out of every dollar, balances the budget within 5 years, and actually then lets the budget grow at 2% a year in the remaining 5 years, and we would be a much stronger nation. If we were to actually balance the budget and then let the country move forward and grow, once again, we would have the greatest confidence. The world would have great confidence in us again. But if we don't do it, I think there is a real problem coming for us. There's going to be a day within the next 10 years that interest will actually exceed $1 trillion. Right now, we're spending $400 billion on interest. So it's a real problem. It's crowding out and becoming one of the largest items we have in the budget. Why can't we get there? You know, what seems to be the problem? The first problem is math. And they have us there's something, it's fuzzy, it's called Washington math. So Washington math, if you read the Washington Post, they'll say, oh no, it's not just cutting 1%, your budget's going to cut $10 trillion over the next 10 years. And here's where the difference is. If we don't spend any more money, let's say last year we spent about $4 trillion, and we keep spending $4 trillion for the next 10 years, would that be cutting any money, or would that be spending the same amount? Be careful what you answer. The Washington Post and the liberal media will tell you that we've now cut $10 trillion if we keep spending the same over 10 years. Why? Because they're anticipating the curve of spending, the baseline of spending is this red line going up. So spending's going up like this, but most people in their normal household income would say, well, I made $40,000 next year, and if I make $45,000, that's an increase. In government, they say, oh no, we anticipated you making $45,000 next year, so it's really not an increase. They work it on a baseline that is elevated, and so if we don't spend $10 trillion more than we spent this year over the next 10 years, they will say that we actually have cut spending. See, this is a real problem. So, for example, on our budget, it says dotted green line. We cut 2% a year over about a 5-year period, and then we allow government to grow at about 2% a year. And people would say, oh, well, doesn't look like you're really cutting spending. That's the truth of the matter. Over about a 10-year period, spending will actually increase 18% over where we are today. But the fake news media will report that we've cut $10 trillion. This is not a rounding error. We say that spending is going up 18%, and the fake news will say, oh, they've cut $10 trillion in spending, and orphans and widows, and the older generation would be all out on the doorstep, and there'd be no government. No, we're talking about a $4 trillion government. It's still going to be spending close to $4 trillion. What we won't do is let it go to $5 trillion over the next 10 years. This is eminently reasonable. And I've talked to people from the right, the left, and the center and said, can you live with 99 or 98% of what you spent last year? I've yet to have a person say that for the good of the country, why don't we do that? And see, what would happen is it would be a compromise. Who drives the spending debate around here? Who drives that we need more spending? It's really both parties, but in recent years, it's been the Republicans. The Republicans say we have to have more military spending. The Democrats say we'll give you more military spending if you give us more welfare spending. So all spending goes up, and that's the compromise. People say we don't compromise. Hey, for spending money, these guys compromise every day, and it's at your expense, and it's why the deficit's so big. What about a different compromise? What if the right and the left said, well, military is important, the left said social welfare is important, and they said, but you know what? For the good of the country, let's spend 99% of what we spent last year on these programs, or 98%. It could be done, but it takes resolve, and the American people need to know that those who are in charge are not doing anything about this. Now, some will argue, and the fake news media has argued, well, it's all about the tax cut. Republicans don't care about the deficit because they cut taxes. Well, it's actually not true. We actually had more revenue last year than the preceding year, even though we did cut taxes. So we had about $14 billion more in taxes, but we had $127 billion more in spending. So the problem is a spending problem. Of all of our spending, there's about $4 trillion in spending, or a little bit more. About 2/3 of that spending is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps. We don't ever vote on any reforms to these programs. These are called the entitlements, and nobody has any bills, no bills come forward to look at the entitlement spending. Why is this a problem? Well, the remaining third of government, which is half military and half welfare, if you eliminated the military spending completely and eliminated welfare spending completely, entitlements still drive the deficit. So what do we have to do? We have to make some tough choices. I was very honest with the people that voted for me. I told them, look, we're living longer and we've had less kids. And so the demographics of Social Security and Medicare don't work. The main reason Medicare and Social Security are short is because we have smaller families. Your grandparents had a whole lot, your great-grandparents had a whole lot of kids, your grandparents had less kids, your parents had less, and kids today are having less. So we have less and less young people and more old people. It's a demographic imbalance. That's why Social Security is short. It's why Medicare is short. But you could fix both of them very easily. You have to gradually raise the age at which we begin taking Medicare and Social Security. We already did it in Social Security. We did it under Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Conservative Republican, liberal Democrat in 1983 came together and said, we're running out of money. What do we do? And so they actually did raise the age from 65 for Social Security very gradually to 67. I haven't heard one person debating it since. Everybody just sort of accepted it and said, look, in order to keep these programs intact, in order not to bankrupt the country, we have to do this. This is what Republicans and Democrats should do now. Come together and say, Social Security is $7 trillion short. Medicare is $35 to $40 trillion short. If you do nothing, they're both going to implode. If you want these programs and you want them to continue, you have to do something. Raising the age very gradually at which people start Medicare and Social Security has to be done. You can either do it now and do it very gradually, a month or two a year over a 20-year period, or you can wait till they're completely bankrupt. If you wait till Social Security is completely bankrupt in like 2034, what happens is everybody has to take a 25% cut. But if you do it very gradually, you won't ever have to have these cuts. It just means that everybody will have to wait a little bit longer to get there. It's important that we do have budgets. We have this enormous deficit or enormous debt of $22 trillion. We're adding $1 trillion each year, and yet the Senate will not vote on a budget this year, other than my budget, and the House, controlled by Democrats, will not vote on a budget either. So you have both houses really not tending to their duty. Now, when we have a vote for the balanced budget amendment, everybody turns out in force and votes. So in 2012, we had a vote in this body, and every Republican voted to balance the budget in 5 years, an amendment to the Constitution that would require 5 years. And yet the Republican budget that's coming out of committee never balances. So we kind of give lip service to this idea. When people are at home campaigning, they pound the table and say, we're going to stop the deficits. We're going to be the frugal party. And guess what? Neither party's been very good with your money. And it's because they're afraid. They get elected and they become afraid that you'll unelect them if they tell the truth. I think maybe we live in a time where it's actually the opposite now, that people want someone to tell the truth. The emperor has no clothes. Social Security spends more money than comes in. If we don't admit these truths and have a discussion on them, and if we're so occupied yelling at each other over elections and who did what during the last election, have you heard any discussion on television? Have you seen one television program talk about Social Security's going bankrupt, $7 trillion short, Medicare's going bankrupt, $35 to $40 trillion short? Have you heard any news program? Have you seen anything on news, right, left, or center, that actually talks about our problems? No, it's yak, yak, yak about the election this and election that, and people are still unhappy with the results of the election, when in reality, maybe we should talk about some of the difficult problems that confront us. I think the number one threat to our national security is our debt. I'm not alone. Admiral Mullen was chief of staff under President Obama. He said the same thing. There are people in the military that understand that maybe our military mission is so big that our military can't keep up with it. You know, if we're going to have troops in 50 of 54 African countries, if we're going to have troops in every Middle Eastern country, if we're going to keep large troop bases in Iraq and in Afghanistan, yeah, maybe you don't have enough money. But maybe our founding fathers said you only go to a war when Congress votes on it. Recently, there's been rattling of sabers over Iran. We're tightening the screws on Iran and not letting them sell oil to anyone. They're getting their back up, and tensions are flaring. Well, the thing is the Constitution said very clearly you don't go to war with any country, including Iran, unless you ask Congress for permission. The president does not have permission to take us to war. A lot of people don't realize this. The founding fathers very specifically didn't want to give that power. In fact, it was Madison who said that the executive is the branch most prone to war. Therefore, we have, with studied care, vested the power to go to war in Congress. And yet, we live in a time in which presidents of both parties take us to war. President Obama began and continued the war in Syria, in Libya. President Trump has continued those things on both sides of the aisle. But it's not just whether it's good or bad foreign policy, it's extraordinarily expensive. So we are bankrupting the American people. We're borrowing money at $1.5 million every minute. And really, it's sort of a crummy gift to the next generation. It's like, oh, by the way, you're lucky. You're going to inherit the national debt, and you'll be paying for it. Kids already realize that they're inheriting this college debt, and it's difficult to pay for college debt. But as you look at this and you look at the individual share, here's 2015, a little low, about $58,000 per person with a debt. But look at what it does over time. It's pyramiding. The debt is sort of beginning to explode because we're just doing nothing to rein it in. And whenever we have a vote over trying to do something about the debt, as we did when we passed the tax cut, I introduced a budget motion that says the tax cut should be paid for with spending cuts. We got 8 Republicans. I introduced another motion that said we should use budget reconciliation, fancy words, for a majority vote to actually rein in the spending and entitlements. I got 4 votes. So there aren't enough people up here. The people up here don't seem to care about the debt. They just think, oh, we'll just pile it on and we'll be fine. But we're hollowing out the country. When people talk about hollowing out the country, the one thing is the debt. We superficially are doing quite well at this point, but there will be a day of reckoning. There's a day of reckoning in which the government has to make a decision, and the decision becomes to print more money to pay for the debt, at which time the country loses the value of its currency. It's happening in Venezuela. You know what the inflation is down there? 130,000%. The money's worthless as soon as they print it. You have to be paid a couple times during the day because if you start work at 8 in the morning, by 5 o'clock in the evening, the money's worth less and less. Virtually has no value. So we have to decide, do you want something for nothing? Do you really believe that we can give you free college? Do you think it's really free? You think nobody's going to have to pay for it? You think we can give you free health care? You think we can give you a free car or a free cell phone? No, somebody pays for it. And if we don't pay for it through taxes, you just pile on the debt and you're destroying the country with it. Most people sort of know this instinctively. There is no ability to have something for nothing. You have to work for it. And the thing is that if we go on and on and on and say, we're just going to keep piling on the debt, the day of reckoning is coming. And when it comes, a once great country could be drugged down by this sort of mountain of debt that we have. So today, my budget will be put forward. It's the penny plan budget. And the penny plan budget basically is now the two-penny budget because it no longer balances in 5 years if we cut 1 penny. But if we cut 2 pennies, meaning that we would next year spend 98% of what we spent this year. Is there anybody in America who thinks that the government and the people who receive stuff from the government couldn't live on 98%? When I tell people to my office who actually work in the private sector, they say, yes, many times in their career, there was a downturn in sales and they had to take less money or less income. Some people have said significantly less or had to cut back on their family expenses. You know what government does? The opposite. If we go into a recession, there's this left-wing, egg-headed idea that we should spend more money. We should go further in debt and just start lavishing out money. Instead of when you're not selling things and things aren't doing as well, you cut back on your consumption. You cut back on things. We have a great country. We shouldn't let it get away from us. I don't think there's any way in the world that we could not move on and become a stronger nation if we would try the penny plan. And like I said, people should pay attention to this because all these representatives, at least on the Republican side, go home and say they're for balanced budgets. But they're not really for balanced budgets if they vote for budgets that never balance. The budget coming out of the Senate committee by Republicans never balances. The budget from the Democrats isn't even made it out of committee. There probably will be no vote in the House or the Senate on the budget. And neither one of them balances ever. It's in the Republican rules that we're supposed to advocate for a budget that balances in at least 10 years. And now we're putting forward budgets that never balance. Look at what the deficit has done. The red is what's already occurred, and then the pink is what is to come. Most of this is driven by entitlements. And you'll hear that as an argument, particularly in the Republican caucus. They'll say, yeah, well, it's all driven by entitlements. We need to do something about entitlements. And then you put forward a bill. I have a bill. I have a bill to reform Social Security by gradually letting the age go up a month or two a year over the next 20 years. I also would means test the benefits, meaning that wealthier people would receive a little bit less Social Security. And people say, well, I don't want to do that. If you don't, the whole system's going to implode. So can't we go ahead and just do it now and do it in the least painful sort of way? But you know how many people I have on my bill? I think there were 4 people brave enough to put their name on a bill that would gradually allow the Social Security age to rise up. But if you talk to people quietly, even on the other side of the aisle, they'll kind of admit to you, yeah, we ought to do something. But nobody ever does anything. The other side says, we'll do it only if you'll raise taxes on the wealthy. Well, we already have a progressive tax code. Interestingly, a lot of people don't know this, our tax code in America is more progressive than Scandinavia. So you've heard some of the clamor for socialism, and they want Swedish socialism. Well, we have higher taxes on the wealthy here than they do in Sweden. In fact, in Sweden and Denmark, it's kind of the opposite, actually. The middle class and the poor are more heavily taxed than in our country. So when you look and you hear people say, well, Sweden and Denmark, why don't we become Denmark? Let's give everybody paid leave, free paid leave. Let's give the uncle of the baby free paid leave. Let's give everybody, the grandparents need paid leave. It's all going to be free. Well, guess what? They do stuff like that in Scandinavia, but everybody pays a 25% sales tax. It's not free. Everybody pays a 25% sales tax in Scandinavia. In addition, the income tax in Denmark and many of the other countries are similar, is 60% at $60,000. You want to buy a car in Scandinavia? You wonder why these people are freezing riding their bike all winter long? It's a 200% tax to buy a car. So if you want to buy a $30,000 car, you've got to have $60,000 up front to pay the government, and then you need another $30,000 to buy the car. It's not free. There's no free lunch. When people say that government can provide you all these things, they can only do it by either taxing you or borrowing. Right now, we're doing it mostly through borrowing. The other thing we've done is, and the reason why I think it's destined probably to get worse over time, is we've gradually taken people off the tax rolls. So really, below $50,000, there's a very minimal amount of income tax being paid. In fact, those who are the top 10% pay almost all of the income tax in our country. So people say, we need to stick it to the rich aren't paying their fair share. Well, guess what? The top 10% pay 87% of the income tax. Almost all of the income tax is paid by the top 10%. If you go to the top 50%, that's $75,000 and above, it's like well over 90%. It's like 96 or 97% of the income tax is paid for by people who make $75,000 and above. So some have been clamoring. There's the young socialist on the other side. She says, we need a special tax on the rich, on those who make $10 million a year. And you've heard this. And even Republicans are saying, well, yeah, let's stick it to the rich. Let's get those really filthy rich people. Let's say you do it. 70% tax on those who make $10 million. Well, let's do the math. What does it bring in? Let's say they all continue to work, and let's say they all pay their taxes and don't move to another country. It brings in $50 billion. Sounds like a lot of money. Well, how much would Medicare for all cost? $60 trillion. All right. The tax brings in $50 billion. The spending proposal just for Medicare for all, $60 trillion. The Green New Deal, add another $10 trillion. Their spending proposals are so big, no one can even define them within a few $1 trillion because they're so enormous. And realize what I said before, the deficit is driven by what you already have. You've got Medicare for senior citizens. It's $35 trillion short. If you were $35 trillion short, does it make sense to now expand Medicare to everyone? So what we have is Medicare for some, Medicare for senior citizens, $35 trillion short, and they want to expand it to everybody? Also realize they want to ban insurance. There'll be no insurance companies and no insurance through your employer. Right now, there's 180 million people who have health insurance. You think it's going to be just, a real pleasant transition to having everybody on the government insurance? And where's the money going to come from? These proposals are ludicrous on their face. We face mounting debt and deficits from what we have. This should be a no-brainer. These people should be laughed out of polite society. No one who is intellectually honest should listen to these people. There's really no reason for them to even be in the discourse because they are so completely out of touch with reality. We have so much debt from what we're already trying to give you through Medicare and Social Security. And these people want to double, triple, and quadruple that. It doesn't work. It's a recipe for disaster. And as you look around the world, as people get more and more debt and more spending, look what happens. Look what happens as we approach socialism around the world. If you look at the examples of socialism from the last century, it's a history of famine and genocide. Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, Castro, Chavez, Maduro. It doesn't work. We actually live in the best time ever to be alive in the history of the world. Does that sound excessive? It's absolutely true. In 1800, 80% of people lived in extreme poverty. When I was born in the 1960s, it was down to a third of the people lived in extreme poverty, $2 a day or less. So it went from 80% to a third. In the span of my lifetime, it's under 10%. I'm not talking about America, I'm talking about the whole world. Less than 10% of the people live in extreme poverty now. But you have to ask yourself, why? How did we get here? Was it just an accident? Was it a fluke? Were we born with like oil under the ground? All of a sudden we got rich? For some nations, sometimes that could be true. But look at Venezuela. They have more oil under the ground, more oil deposits than any other country in the world. And socialism took the richest country in the world and made it the poorest country in the world. They're eating their pets in Venezuela. They're starving. The average person has lost 20 pounds. What does that have to do with the budget? They got overextended. Their deficit became massive, even in the face of oil revenue. People say, well, America's a rich country. Yes, we're a rich country, but we are overextended. I don't want our country to be Venezuela. When the president said America will not become a socialist nation, I took that at face value. But if we don't want to be a socialist nation, we can't keep piling on the debt. So what I have today is a proposal. We'll see if anybody chooses it. My prediction is not one Democrat will vote to balance the budget. Now, they'd vote to hike all your taxes $1,000,000%, which would kill the economy. Then they'd say, oh, that's how we'd balance the budget. But they won't vote to cut any spending. They won't vote to even control spending. My budget over 10 years actually slowly increases spending over time. We keep it steady and we cut it 1 or 2% for 5 years, and then we allow it to grow at 2%. We could do that and be a stronger country, but we have to examine the failures in history. We have to examine what has happened under socialism, big government, and debt in other countries, and decide whether we want to go that way. Decide whether we are going to simplistically say, give me, give me, give me. I want something for nothing, and there's no reason why I should have to work for it, and it's just not fair unless you give it to me. Realize there will be a price. There is no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as something for nothing. So I offer this budget to the American people, and I hope you'll watch how your representatives vote. Not one Democrat will vote for it, but over half the Republicans won't vote for it either. They'll say it's too dramatic. We can't cut spending that much. 1 penny out of a dollar is what I've been proposing for 5 years. I usually get 15 to 20 votes. Now we've had to go up to 2 pennies for every dollar because nobody's really doing anything to cut spending, and spending's still exploding. So this is called the two penny plan budget now. It would be 98% of last year. We'd spend 98% next year of what we spent this year. I think the American people would support it. I hope the American people will pay attention today to how people vote, and I urge my colleagues to vote for the penny plan budget.